Let's get started. I am an imposter or a substitute. My dear friend and colleague, Bob Berg, who organized this session and conceived of it, was taken with a serious, life-threatening infection problem that put him into the hospital, and he is now out of the hospital, but under doctor's orders to stay home and be taken care of by his wife and not come to Egypt. So he gave me a little memorandum, which I'm not going to read all of, but just some of the thoughts that he wanted to share with you if he had been here and been chairing the session. Bob is had been a lifelong worker in the development field, and he'd been doing some traveling recently to Africa, and wanted to have me mention some of his thoughts just kind of to warm us up into the subject of this panel from two of the countries he had recently visited. One of them is Rwanda, which of course you're all familiar with, in regard to the terrible violence there some years back. He describes it as a densely populated country that can't really create additional agricultural space without running into destroying its ecology. And the country's government has made a decision to place a heavy emphasis on creating a science and technology society, which would be a marvelous step in many ways from what it had been, which was highly agricultural and also highly divided, as I'm sure everybody who has ever read a newspaper knows about. Right now it's in the vanguard of modernizing countries that are based on science and technology strategies. Computer skills are taught in Costa Rica, for example, which is one of the countries that Rwanda's leaders are basing their work on. They're looking for investment in infrastructure policies that have attracted the likes of Intel and an expanding range of information technology and science and tech initiatives that have flourished. Again, we're still talking about Costa Rica, which is kind of what Rwanda isn't yet, but what it is kind of choosing as a model of what it hopes to become. Rwanda now has a national policy on science, technology, and innovation, and hopes to become a regional center of excellence, particularly focused on ICT. The key aim of this policy, Bob says, is to transform rural society into a more science-based development of the country. This means making that a basic part of its economic development and cultural development in the future. Another country that Bob reported on in his brief little note that I'll mention here is Mozambique. The two countries, he says, have some of the highest growth rates in the world. Mozambique started its revival as one of the poorest countries in the world, particularly in the rural area where 2/3 of the population live. There are growing literacy rates there now, particularly in urban areas, but the great majority of those in the rural areas are still illiterate. So the country has a long way to go in that regard. Mozambique, he says, is now addressing the core areas of weakness in a society that wants to become far more science-based. Policies and programs focus on education, innovation systems, innovation infrastructure, and institutional regimes. Under a comprehensive plan, implementation began just 5 years ago. And he mentions among some of the early programs there is creating a national transmission network, universal and affordable email, and fostering telecenters. Many of the actions to create e-government, and as a very poor country, Mozambique has seen e-government as not only providing better services, but cheaper servicing costs, and major content applications such as information systems on HIV and AI and AIDS, and much more distance education and ICT observatory and creation of country development safeways. Excuse me for just kind of reading something to you, but poor old Bob is off there and resting in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to bring some of what his background was that led him to putting together this panel. I have here two really remarkable panelists. I don't know if either of you has a preference as to who will go first. Let me introduce them in the
He's already written down.
So, I first met Susantha Gunatilaka about 20 years ago, as I recall. And I first met him through his writing in, was it the Futures Journal, where he had done some really fascinating work on what he saw as the future development of biotechnology, and wrote a couple of articles along those lines. And I didn't know who he was, but I assumed from the name Susantha, which sounds like Susan plus Tha, that he was a lovely woman from Sri Lanka. And I found out that he was not that. He was a lovely man from Sri Lanka. And I got to know him personally at a meeting of the World Academy of Art and Science, where he worked with Jonas Salk, and I understand got to know Jonas better later. And his background is he's done teaching and research at several universities, including Exeter and Sussex in the university in UK, the New School in Columbia in the US, the Malaya and the Philippines. He has a number of books. He doesn't write very clearly, but he has written a number of books, and he is now the head of the 160-year-old Royal Asiatic Society in Sri Lanka, which provides a bridge to Western and Eastern knowledge systems. He's a former president of the Sri Lanka Association for the Advancement of Science. I know both of these folks that we have here today have extensive background and close-up background on what we want to talk about, which is how countries that are very much backward in terms of science and technology and very much eager to, good God, to make a leap forward with that, and they're working in that field. So the second person I'll introduce, who may or may not be the second person to speak, is Heba Gamal, who comes from Egypt, of all places, and has a fascinating career. First working, that was the course, yeah. About what? About this? Okay. Worked for some time for Google in Silicon Valley in California, and moved into what she really wanted to do, which was international development, and worked in a project in Lebanon for some time, and has been working now for some years for an organization with a wonderful name of TechSoup. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the organization, but it's focused entirely on technology and bringing technological skills and capabilities to both private sector and communities, governments. So with that, did we decide who was going to speak first?
You introduced something.
What I'm going to talk about was a story that I did not finish about 15 or 16 years ago, when I spent 1 year in UN headquarters surveying for its global report on the world, surveying the new technologies, namely biotechnology and information technology. And I hit on this key issue, namely that biotechnology and its adoption hits an ethical barrier. In the US, I think those who are familiar with the US are aware that, say, the Catholic Church has particular definitions of life and death, which has strong implications on bioethics. Similarly, Christian fundamentalists have a very different view on and down to the level of storming and sometimes shooting people doing abortions. And there are also a group called secular atheists, but extremely also Eurocentric. So I surveyed around the globe and found that there were huge gaps. The Islamic countries had done some work, the Judaic tradition had done some work, but there was largely nothing done in non-Western countries. I came across that Japan, for example, did not accept brain death because its Buddhist tradition implied that the mind and body was whole, but then later they had adopted brain death. So what I am presenting is a search along those lines. It depends on a major workshop I organized, a conference I organized in India on Indic traditions of philosophy and what to do with the new technologies, and also with some colleagues in the Transhumanist Association, where I was asked to present a paper at Yale on what would be the nature of the biotechnology beast. Okay, ongoing developments are transforming the very basic of what makes us physical and mental. You would have seen the last two presentations in the large hall, and you would have seen all this sort of genetic stuff. And the convergence of nanotechnology, bioengineering, information sciences, and cognitive research are creating vast opportunity to change who we are. For example, mental activities are projected onto computing artifacts. Simple things like this or onto the cloud or onto artificial intelligence devices. Artifacts themselves outperform humans as mental processors. For example, even this computer will do far greater arithmetic than I can even dream of, and much more. And if one is into a program like genetic algorithms or neural networks and combinations thereof, it will do problems that even the programmer cannot quite comprehend. Human sensors are artificially projected outwards. Say, this is one, but you can have much larger ones through, say, the internet, where you are projecting yourself. And it extends beyond human boundaries. The body is projected outwards and introjected inwards. We are being intervened. We will discuss that a bit later. Synthetic biology, which we heard of in the last session, would redesign our genomes and create new life forms. Ventnor is on this. What's called the Human Connectome Project, which expects to give the big picture of the neural structure of the brain, opens the doors to change the very apparatus through which we perceive the world. Once we know the knowledge, it means of restructuring what we could, in theory, change the windows for our physical perceptions. We could introject brainstem cells and partially rewire ourselves so that we could switch one frame of biologically knowing to another world. We have also seen brain cells in petri dishes who have been connected to robotic devices who do some human-like tasks with, I'm quoting from the original paper, some sense of what is going on in themselves. Tomorrow you'll see one of these guys from Warwick, who I think 15 years ago had a chip on his arm, and he's doing some fancy stuff. So, and mind reading technology is creating consumer goods already for $200. You can buy a cap through which you can control the computer. And making possible, in principle, to remotely access the visual content of mental processes. So what goes on inside can be scanned. Fast, broad bandwidth interfaces directly between the human brains and machines will transform work, control automobiles. These are not fancy stuff. If you just Google around, you'll find this. Ensure superiority of military vehicles, enable new sports and art forms. Examples can be that we could be more durable, healthy, energetic, easier to repair, resistant to stress, biological threat, and the aging process. It will, in many foundational ways, be non-human as we know it. There's a group called the Transhumanist Group. I am some sort of card-carrying member, which look forward for that age. So biotechnology, and in its various forms, would reform life, death, health, and beauty. The ethical as well as aesthetic criteria on which these are decided upon are deeply culture-bound. So what goes on in Egypt may not necessarily be. For instance, if we had the ability to transform what we look like, the frame on which we look like in Egypt would be different from what we look in Japan or what we look in China or in different parts of India. So if these transformational possibilities are debated within different cultural traditions, it would give different answers from those in the West. Unfortunately, the questions have been asked only in the West, and so we have to give the answers. We must have the conversations. Advanced IT aims at partial cloning of the mind, and these, for instance, deep questions. These are deep questions of parts of Asia. I come from that part of the world, which has constantly argued on the nature of the mind. And so the mind is now being cloned. So Asian inputs on ethics and nature of artificial influence would strongly influence the direction of IT. We are, or will be, indeed we are constructing and reconstructing the human body, mind, from all these new developments. For example, in clones, robots, cyborgs, or their admixtures. So we are playing God, rather. Gods will be now praying for us. No, praying to us. So there are new ethical challenges not met before, because we are restructuring the body and mind. It is a subject of intense discussion on the essential nature of the human that is being intruded upon by these technologies. What am I? What are we? And the deep questions are raised by these new developments. They intrude not only on S&T, but also on ethics. Ethics are not universal. You saw that French person, the Nobel Prize winner, last 20 minutes he was preaching. He was preaching essentially from a Eurocentric frame, and I must add, from a deeply uninformed frame of other cultures. So the ethics on which these issues have been hitherto discussed are Western ones. It has partly been touched upon on Islamic ones, but I'm going to concentrate on Hindu-Buddhist or Confucian or Alexandrian ideas have not influenced these debates. These challenge existing ethical systems. The dominant Western religious ethical systems are derived from the Abrahamic family of religions, Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. By and large, they are similar. The ethical system is handed over by an entity up there and is revealed as God's word. There may be disputes among the three, but that's a basic thing. There are also secular ethics in the West, but they are Eurocentric ethics, ultimately derived from Greek ideas of philosophy, and which are not universal. And they are ultimately derived from the idea of humanity, a Eurocentric concept of humans as sacred that probably derives from the ideas of the humanists as Europe emerged from the Dark Ages, from the Dark Christian Ages. But in an increasingly non-human and post-human world, humanity has to be transcended in search of ethics. And these are. So many challenges rest on what is to be a person and the nature of the self. What are we? Continuous change of the self and the person in body and mind is the condition of what we are emerging as. A major cultural approach. I'm going to give one example. Pardon me for being ethnocentric, but this is an area that has not been covered, so I want to partly provoke you. A major cultural approach that has continuous change as its goal is Buddhist philosophy, which influenced almost the whole of Asia, apart from parts of Philippines, at one time or the other, including from Iran to Japan. Now, the core Buddhist, I must first emphasize, though I come from a Buddhist background, I do not believe in the irrational. I don't believe in the unprovable. And I believe that these approaches have a direct relevance when the human and his or her environment are constructed and reconstructed. The central Buddhist position is that both the body and mind, as well as the environment, is not given or sacred, but constructed and changing. That is the core Buddhist philosophy. And it has a direct relevance to what we... Now, in using Buddhist philosophy, I must again say that I do not believe in rebirth and step. I'm taking only the observational aspects of Buddhism and its philosophical texts. Now, in discussing bioethics, there are major differences between the Abrahamic religions and the non-Abrahamic religions. The Abrahamic religion is revealed. For example, the Asian religions is a mixture of the unprovable and also combined with observation and philosophy. I don't want to go into this. So I don't believe in unprovable. The central core philosophy of Buddhism is anicca and anatta. Okay, don't get worried about those. It means impermanence and change and no abiding soul or self. There is no soul, there is no self. It's a process. These are not mystical, but realistic and matter-of-fact statements. So the Buddhism takes on the person, takes on the human. There is nothing durable of static being. Continuity of life is not through an abiding permanence, but through a changing process, and that is what is called I. So it is the world's first process philosophy, till Whitehead and so on came in the last 100 years or so. So it deconstructs radically the body and the mind, breaks down physical and mental factors, and it's a quote from some of the Buddhist texts. There is no materiality, no feeling, no perception, no formation, no consciousness that is permanent, everlasting, eternal, and not separable from the idea of change. So even consciousness is changing. So when neither self nor anything self can truly and really be found, this speculative view that I am permanent, abiding, everlasting, unchanging is solely and completely foolish. What I am is neither matter, sensation, perception, mental formations, nor consciousness. Physical elements change as do mental phenomena. All are in a state of perpetual becoming. All phenomena are but fleeting strings and chains of events. As the constituents of an individual change, she does not remain the same for two constituent moments. In the morning, total erroneous picture of the Dalai Lama saying that Buddhism is to be kind. It's not so. So there is no individual. life is a stream and an unbroken succession of aggregates. There is no break, so it's a process. The continuity is not through a soul, but through a stream of becoming. This analysis is partly arrived at from observing the innermost subjective felt inside the person. And this is what you call Buddhist meditation, is to internally observe these changes. So observing from within our own innermost subjectivity, I is shown to be a false one. From such a perspective, the question raised by new technologies can be seen differently. The existential angst of being a hybrid, of having genes of plants and animals inside one, is seen differently. The problems of one's self being spread over several artifacts now loses its potential terror. The threat of being a cyborg, of Frankenstein's creature, the concerns of Jeremy Rifkin, who is a fundamental critic of biotechnology, is seen differently. Rifkin once wrote that living things are no longer perceived as carrots and peas, foxes, and hens. All living beings are drained of their aliveness and turned into abstract messages. There is no longer any question of sacredness. How could there be when there are no longer any recognizable boundaries to respect? Rifkin continued, bioengineering winds its way through the many passages of life, stripping one living thing after another, replacing the original creations with technologically designed replicas. The world gradually becomes a lonelier place. But Buddhist thought stripped this seeming sacredness several thousand years ago. So a gene does not make a sentient being. Only the stream of beings existent of an onward flowing history makes one. If to this lineage are added new elements, new parts, it is but in the very normal nature of such streams. A person's normal existence is of a construct. We are constructed. The environment is constructed. Environment is not sacred. The artificial introduction of elements into one is also a similar process. So from a realist perspective, there is no difference. But such a perspective makes one squeamish, raises fright, alarm, and even disgust. One would not mind a set of false teeth, even an implanted one, a prosthesis for one's limbs, a walking stick, or for that matter, even a motorized, electronically controlled one, even through the mind. But messing up one's interiority evokes entirely different emotions. Aliens taking over our minds, raises different feelings of one's own consciousness being invaded. It's putting doubt on one's own subjectively felt oneness that is at stake. But in such instances, the Buddhist view had been very firm, rejecting the view of persons who take the thing called mind or consciousness to be an unchanging substance. In that case, it was better, it's argued in the text, for a person to take the physical body as an unchanging self. Well, at least you can.
Could you wrap up?
Okay.
Leave the rest for discussion time?
Okay. So basically, there's a whole lot of stuff which says that we are virtually puppets and so on. So this goes against the current of one's own internalized thing. So my proposition is that one could use some of these thoughts into looking at the modern condition and the future condition that we will be in, where we are constructing ourselves and we are playing gods. And a whole lot of quotes here. And so aside, Buddhist ethics is not absolute. People who have been mass murderers have realized so Buddhist ethics are situational. And so those who are creating a new humanity are doing ultimately a Buddhist thing. And in that perspective, ultimately, there would not be a difference between a thinking robot and ourselves. We ourselves are thinking robots. So I think we should welcome the future and be unafraid.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. One thing I would just like to point out before we move on is that the discussions about technology, and particularly biotechnology, whether you want them to or not, whether, excuse me, no much how you might want them to be totally rational debates, they sooner or later come back to some fundamental questions about what is natural and what are natural boundaries. And the question not simply what they are, but are there any such natural boundaries at all that impede what we might be able to do with technology from outside. With that thought, which we'll come back to depending on how much time we have, I'll turn to Heba, and I think we'll probably get into a whole different field of...
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I know last sessions are always really, really hard, so I hope I don't bore you to sleep. Thank you, Walter, for the great introduction. Just to add on, my name is Heba Gamal, and as Walter mentioned, I worked for Google for a long time, and there I was managing search quality for the Middle East and North Africa. That involved working very closely with engineers and product managers on figuring out how we can best localize the product for those countries. But my true passion, I think, has always been international development. So I took some time off and worked with an amazing organization called kiva.org, a microfinance peer-to-peer crowdsource funding organization. And I lived in Lebanon working with them on that project. And then I decided that I know exactly the two things that I love and I'm passionate about, which are social good and technology, and I wanted to combine the two. So I decided to move on and move to a very, very cold place, probably the coldest place I've ever lived in, which is Poland. And I started working with an organization called TechSoup Global. Thank you. And with TechSoup Global, what we do is we work with organizations all over the world to help build their technology capacity through giving them hardware and software solutions from major multinational companies and corporations at a discounted price. Long introduction, but I wanted to quickly just say that I'm really sad not to have Bob here. He's the person who invited me, and he's actually one of my mentors. So I wish him very speedy recovery, and hope he can join us next time. And I hope you can all send him get well wishes and vibes so that he can get better soon. All right. So I think it's pretty easy after that long introduction I gave you about where I come from and what my background is. I refer to myself as a techie or a geek or a nerd. But a techie is a person who is an expert. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I'm definitely very enthusiastic about technology. And I think it has, it can be used and is being used to transform the way we are living and to transform the countries that we're passionate about, the countries that we come from. It's transforming whole economies. It's creating livelihood. It's creating ways that people can combine their passion with social good. It's creating ways for people to explore new areas that they can contribute to society with. And I think it's just really important to set the stage before I start talking about all of the things I'm going to talk to you about today. So obviously, given my background, I'm a huge enthusiast of the internet. I think the internet has transformed our lives, transformed the way we live. It has created, like I said earlier, opportunities for collaborations, for livelihood that had never existed before. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of of really interesting things that have started happening these past few years. Let's say you have a property that you don't use. It's an extra property. For example, let's say you're a Cairean, you're from Cairo, and you have a property here in Alexandria. You can take pictures of that property, put it on a website called Airbnb, and make a livelihood out of that. You rent it per night. For anyone who's visiting Alexandria can stay there. It's an alternative way of living your life. It's an alternative way for people to travel. It's an alternative way to approach seeing a new city. That's just one of the many, many ways the internet has created a whole new platform and a whole new opportunity for living life and making a living. But most importantly, the internet has created opportunities, like I said. And I think for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to focus on three major areas that I think the internet has really helped develop and grow in a very new way. The first one is innovation. I think the internet has driven innovation in a whole new direction, a whole new path. One of the things that I believe the internet has done is what I refer to as the democratization of innovation. Something that we, and I say this with a grain of salt, being in a science conference, but something that was...
Could you give us that phrase again?
The democratization of innovation. Something that I think was long, historically speaking, the preserve of the technocratic elite, where people get in a room, start thinking about an idea, innovate behind closed doors, and the rest of us, the average person who most likely actually is going to interact with that technology, was not allowed into that process at all. The internet has completely opened that. It has opened it to an extent to where you don't even have to be just a participant. You can even be a leader in the process of innovation, which I think is huge and is really, really important for all of us to be aware of and to take part in. Another thing that the internet has created is something that we all, I'm sure, in many, many ways need in our daily lives and seek, which is community. It's amazing how you, through the internet, can now find a space. There is a space that has been created for people that share and have a common interest and passion. And they can meet, and they can be anywhere in the world. They can be completely distributed all over the world. But the internet has done three things in that regard. It has made them find each other, interact with one another, and then ultimately work and collaborate, which is something that was unprecedented before. Before the internet, if you didn't have the resources to actually travel and go to other places and have that connection, you wouldn't be able to speak to people who have the same passions but live in a completely different context and can give you a completely fresh set of ideas. Finally, I think the internet has created room for development. It has created many, many opportunities in the area for development. And here I'm speaking mostly about the development of international development, the development of societies, of communities, the development of the movement of social good, the opportunity to tackle the world's biggest problems now it's still, of course, a very, very big challenge, but it's much, much easier, and there's opportunity for us to tackle it in so many different ways that, again, didn't exist before. This brings me to the case that I'm actually going to try to make to you today, which is the case for making a case for the third sector. Is anyone familiar with that term, third sector? Yeah? Okay.
Maybe you ought to give the
Yes.
definition.
Yeah, I will.
You did.
I will. So the third sector is roughly referred to as the voluntary and community sector. It can be comprised of many different types of organizations, mostly what we commonly refer to as nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations. These organizations tend to be neither public nor private. They're historically very independent of government, which is very historically important for their culture, which is a very value-driven culture, meaning that they're motivated by their desire to achieve social goals. They're also, unlike the private sector, they're not motivated by making a profit or maintaining revenue in a way. Any surplus that they make is reinvested and kind of redistributed back into achieving their goals. Some of these organizations can also be social enterprises, which are a hybrid between business and community work or community service, or achieving something socially good on a larger scale. They also tend to be very diverse because they tend to have many different faces and colors and shapes and sizes depending on what it is that they're trying to address. And they tend to be very socially inclusive because they're very close to the community, and most of the time they are trying to solve a problem or a challenge that the community as a whole is facing. Why am I talking to you about the third sector? Or why in particular do I think the third sector is important? I think the third sector it can play a very important role in fostering technology, and that's mostly because of a few things. The third sector has the ability to deliver solutions to the needs of the community that the government traditionally cannot really address. We can actually argue whether the government can address that or not, but at least for a certain time or for a long time, the government sometimes fails to address these needs. The other really important thing about the third sector is the direct impact on the economy. Like I said earlier, these are organizations that are not necessarily focused on profit. Not that they want to be in the negative, but they are mostly concerned with keeping their operations afloat, and they have very innovative ways of distributing their revenue, sharing their profits, and reinvesting it back into their goals and motivations. Another very important point is the closeness to the community. Like I said earlier, the third sector is usually created, or an organization in the third sector is usually created to address a need, to address an issue, a problem, a challenge that they see in the community. So they tend to build and strengthen very close ties with the community that usually the private sector lacks and usually the public sector struggles with. But most importantly, the third sector tends to be very innovative, and I personally think the younger generation in the third sector tends to be very innovative. And that's mostly in developing solutions to social issues and challenges. Now let me ask you, how can we use the third sector to foster science and technology? And I'm a bit biased, and I'm mostly talking about technology here, but still. I think there's a really interesting way, an interesting formula that I've seen work, and I think that if we push it forward, we can really see some really interesting results. And that's a very untraditional alliance. If you put the third sector businesses and what I refer to people like myself, techies and geeks, together, you can really come up with very innovative solutions. I'm going to talk to you about a model that I've seen work, which I think is a fantastic model, which is basically working with businesses, like I said, the third sector, and individuals that are just really enthusiastic about using technology for social good. What you do is you bring those people together into a room, and you basically state a problem statement. You put it on a blackboard, and you say, this is the problem statement we're having. It could be something like, I'll give you an example from where I've seen this work. In Romania, there's a really big problem with abandoned cars. People park the cars and just leave them. They completely abandon them. So when you go to different places, especially very crowded places, and I'm sure here in Egypt we can all relate, people are frustrated because these are abandoned cars that were just parked and left there. But no one, and they don't move, no one knows who the owner is, they're just there, and they're taking up a parking spot that you or I could use. What happened was, we brought together a bunch of people. We brought together some really young, enthusiastic folks who have interests in many different areas. Oops. There we go. Who have interests in many different areas, such as technology, business, entrepreneurship. And then we brought businesses, actual big businesses like, you could say Microsoft or Google or people who know Drupal technology really well. And then we brought the third sector organizations that work in the community. And what we did is we brought them together and had them meet up, talk about the problem, talk about what the issue is, and then close the door on them and let them just brainstorm together. And it's amazing what happens. People come up with ideas. People get really excited. These types of events could be called many different things, but one of the more common names now is a hackathon. So you basically close the room on those people for 48 hours. Give them some pizza, some soda, maybe some Red Bull if they really are dying, and you just let them be. And it's amazing the type of social innovation that takes place. And that's exactly what happens. This is when social innovation happens. These people just start creating new things. They start building applications. In the case of Romania, to go back to that example, a bunch of really enthusiastic young people used some open source technology and created an app where you basically can take a picture, and that picture gets automatically translated onto a map, basically transferred onto a map, and you can have that application on your phone. You open your phone, you can check before you get to a certain area or a certain radius where those abandoned cars are. And then that sends messages to government authorities that are supposed to take away those cars after a certain period, because it shows the log of when the first person that saw that car took that picture. Amazing stuff. And I mean, this is just a regular cycle, but if you get those people meeting together on a regular basis, I don't know if you've heard of things like Meetup or Net Squared. Those are all or random hacks of kindness. Those are all these types of ideas where you bring those three groups together and just have them be creative, think about a problem together. The key here is passion, of course, and the key here is also enthusiasm. People have to be really interested in solving those issues, and they do, and they come up with really great ideas. The other example I want to give you, just with those exact same groups, is around mentorship. I was involved with an organization called Ashoka. Maybe some of you have heard of them, in the Bay Area, and I basically worked with them on their youth program, where we mentored high school students. Usually, in their last 2 years of high school, and they come together and they come up with a social enterprise idea. The group that I mentored came up with the idea of, in a lot of the Bay Area high schools, you're not supposed to wear certain colors or certain T-shirts with certain messages because of gang-related violence and things like that. So they came up with the idea of doing something really cool. They didn't want to do uniforms because, of course, if you're a high school student, you don't want to look like everyone else. And at the same time, they didn't want to break the rules. So they came up with this amazing idea of creating T-shirts that had really amazing, inspiring messages from singers that they looked up to, from sports people, from technology people, any role models that they had, but they had really encouraging words, and they didn't look the same. They had different colors and sizes. And whatever money they used, they poured that money back into the local community so that local shops that create T-shirts don't go out of business because, there's a big Walmart around the street or something that creates T-shirt or makes T-shirt at a really low cost. And they created a website about it and linked all of the different T-shirts with videos and or speeches from the people that made or that they had the quotes from. Very, very fascinating. In that room, again, we had mentors like myself. At the time, I worked in the private sector. We had the organization being represented by Ashoka, but then we had the businesses actually come in and fund those projects. And that's the synergy that you need. You need to get those three people, three different parts of society working together to come up with really, really enthusiastic and creative ideas to push technology forward and to, at the same time, solve issues that we face in everyday life. The other area that I think, or other untraditional alliance that I think would be really, really helpful is an alliance between, again, the third sector, government, and academia. One of the things that I think you would find very interesting is more and more countries now are adopting new laws to include, recognize, and build a structure around social enterprises. The UK has done some really amazing stuff around that. But why? Why is that important? Social enterprises, by definition, are businesses that have a social mission. So they can take on, again, many, many different forms and looks. So you can be hiring people from the community, for example, or you can have some sort of a profit sharing model where you pour the money back into the community or the business, and that gets transferred to the people. Fascinating and really, really interesting and very, very innovative. One organization that I met with a few months ago is a French organization that does exactly that. What it does is it goes out and it targets social enterprises that are focused on new technology and meets with them, helps them put together their business plans, understands what their business offering is, and takes that to big companies and basically tries to match those really, really small startups with a social mission with big companies to become their vendors.
Yeah, I hate to do this, but I'm going to ask you to
Wrap up.
In a few minutes and leave time for both Alberto as a discussant and for the
Absolutely. This is my last slide, thankfully.
Okay.
So let me just wrap up by saying the other great alliance here that would be fantastic, and I think this is the perfect group to be addressing this to, is academia. We, in BVA Next, over the weekend, we had a speaker talk extensively about the importance of having an entrepreneur on a team of researchers, because you need someone who's street smart, someone who knows how to talk the talk and give a presentation and do the business side of things. That's exactly what we need. We need to encourage more and more people in academia to work with those groups, to work with the third sector, to work with new technology in order to move it forward. I'm going to end here, but before I end, I want to say that I think all of this is being fueled and moved and pushed forward by something that I refer to as the moral hunger. This is something that we're seeing all over all over the internet, all over new technology. Just something that, I mean, in just a few, just so I can wrap up quickly, but this translates to Wikipedia. What makes someone stay up till 4 in the morning writing an article? We all have this moral hunger, and I think we need to feed it by giving back and utilizing this amazing sea of knowledge that is now available to us to do good and to continue fostering technology. That's
beautiful.
it.
Thank you. All right, we have a visitor from Rome, Alberto Zucconi, who's a very prominent psychologist, head of a major psychology organization in Italy, which he will undoubtedly want to mention to us, and who thinks about everything. And I'd like to get just a few reactions, and then be sure, Alberto, to leave us some time so we have some room for questions from the audience.
Indeed. If I understood correctly, the very interesting words pronounced by everybody here, starting with Bob Berg, being read by Walt Anderson, and so Walt and Susanta, and then the last speaker, Bala, I hear a narrative that is always addressing the issue of value. Value that make a difference for the good or the bad of this world. So, not by chance, I suppose, that Bob Berg was organizing this event with the Alliance for Peace Building, and I can see exactly the connection, and this last speaker was underlying that in several ways, that fostering science and technology, whatever is in the Middle East or Africa or in New York, because there are a lot of underdeveloped area and poverty and injustice and lack of rights all over the world, is an issue that where value. And another thing in terms of value that I heard all the speakers speak about is respect. The need to respect what? Well, interesting enough, to respect the rights, the human nature, as new human nature is being transformed all the time. In my opinion, actually, it's been always like this, not only now that there's going to be this interaction man-machine, but unfortunately, in many ways, the construing and reconstruing of the human body and mind is the history of humanity, and also of the oppression of people by people abusing power over them. For example, let's remind how women have been suffering of this body construing, the foot binding in medieval Japan, even today's the sexual mutilation. And what about slavery as a interaction man-machine and person-machine? Interesting enough, I was touched by the question, if I understood correctly, what is to be a robot? Well, again, a value, empathy. If we don't have empathy, we will not understand anything that we're going around in promoting. And so here the enthusiasm I was touched of using technology for what? Well, we have heard in the General Assembly about the Manhattan Project. That's technology, and that's value also. But value can go both ways. And so some enthusiasm of doing good, and so value-added technology, and so many aspects of that. Even in the other session, we had understood how technology added value if it's combined with human value, and so empowerment. We have the Negroponte, another organization, computer dissemination. We have solar villages where electricity was never heard of before. We have barefooted colleges. We have microfinancing that our friend here was involved. And again, what do we have here? Empowerment, and so society, if it's combining synergetically the community with non-profit organization, with business interested to promote value, not only money and finance, can, as well as non-profit, government, and academia, create a way to satisfy what our friend said here, the moral hunger. And this is really a challenge that I hope not only conference but projects that are in the everyday life can realize, because the odds are not small and the need for enthusiasm, I guess, is always growing. Let's hope to feed all the needs that we have in this changing world.
Thank you very much, Alberto.
Assalamu alaikum.
A little closer, I think. Yeah.
I have a question to ask to Heba. I'm sorry, I don't know the title, so I said Heba. Okay. First of all, thank you for your fruitful and interesting presentation. My question is, here in Egypt, our community is full of very, 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 very much problems, as is obvious, and we have many organizations, many NGOs, many volunteers. The number of volunteers almost above 1 million. What's the missing? What's the missing ingredient? What's the missing stuff? There is a problem, and and the fund, when the fund is available, still the problem isn't solved. I need advice from you as a great expertise that you have. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That is a fantastic question, and actually really, really hard to answer.
Could you repeat sort of the core of the question?
Sure. So the question is, in Egypt, I'm guessing you're referring especially in the last year or so, there are many, many NGOs that were created, the number of volunteers and people who are willing to join the sector and work in the sector, and funds have been flowing into the sector. However, there is a problem, but there isn't really a solution being found. Like I said, I think that's a really good question. I think what's missing is, like I said earlier, I come from the business world, so at the end of the day, I measure impact. And I think that's really what's missing, is that there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of commitment, but there isn't enough goal setting and impact measurement that's happening at the end of projects, at the end or throughout even the project process. And I think that's really the missing ingredient. However, though, and I tend to be a bit positive and always look at the glass half full, I think that there are some amazing projects happening. I think that the use of technology recently in Egypt has brought out so much talent, so much. I'm actually quite interested in all of this, of course, so I'm going to be meeting with a lot of very new groups. There are many, many groups that were created just in the past few months where people can go and work collaboratively, for example, open creative spaces where you can go, and if you're a computer scientist, you can just go and hack away and work with someone else who's working on designing a project for farming or something. There are amazing online initiatives that have taken off that are really, really good about educating people, for example, about the judicial system and the governmental system that had never existed before. But back to your question, I think what's missing is definitely measuring the impact and setting goals.
Great, thank you. Back to the very patient gentleman in the aisle there.
I'm a solution architect in the telecom industry
Uh-huh.
in Europe, and falling back on the question, if I may add, how can the community, the value-driven community, foster or give birth to new communities here in the Middle East region, where they can put guidelines or make nobody's going to reach the solution, but at least the community can foster the guidelines or the methodology to go in the right track to go for a solution. For instance, we have the political democratic entropy. Everybody is talking, everybody is unstructured, nobody's qualified. So how about coming with a solution based on people's mind sharing, mind mapping ideas on a portal or on a content management system where everybody just posts their ideas, come up with ranking values, make ranking systems, and then perceive that as guidelines towards a solution. Nobody knows where this country is heading. There's a lot of political, economical, global interest, as I know that the motive or the moral hunger is first happiness, bridge the technology to the ground, the poor have equality among the poor and the rich. Of course, we were hearing this conference very idealistic things, yeah, the technology babble, the beautiful things, okay, and a couple of messages always being repeated. We want funds from outside, we want our organization, we want economic investment, but we need to be the change. We are the change to start. We need to create the infrastructure for importing these solutions. Nobody is going to come to the Egyptian society, give us a couple of cash, bring some more funds, and this is going to wrap up the whole thing. Even if they invest billions and billions, only it's a drop in the ocean. Exactly. It's not going to foster anything. So how can we make use of your initiatives and entrepreneurship to create a community-based or driven, value-driven society to foster the solutions? Not the solutions, but at least go on the right track with a scientific methodology, with no self-interest, with no money talks, with no cross conflicts, political or private or public sectors, or it's everything works in cross interests among the parties. How can we have this mindset of going from our endo-self to the exo-self, and bring, of course, I know that your community probably is the number one factor, if you ask me what's the motive for that, would be happiness, self-happiness, and self-fulfillment, not just another economic or...
I think you answered your own question.
Yeah, but how, no, my question is, how can we give birth to a new society? How can you...
Bring people together. I'm sure you know people that think like you. Bring them into a room and start creating a meetup. Start meeting together and fostering that community. Even if you don't know these people yet, find them, and I'm sure you will. Find them online. Find them through friends. The values that you're talking about, I believe, exist in almost all of us. Yes, of course, there are bad people out there, and let's hope we don't run into them. But we tend to be attracted or drawn to people that are like us. So I'm sure in your own community, you have at least 2 friends that have the exact same values that you're talking about. And if you bring those people, they'll bring 2 other people. And if those 2 people bring 2 other people,
synergy.
You have,
yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Okay, that's an answer.
Right,
that's a
you.
very good answer. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Among my friends, it was one of the guys who started the initiative in the Revolution 2.0 or something.
Okay.
And we discussed a lot about, okay, moving forward. Now everybody's talking, everybody's brainstorming or prophetizing that he has the big picture or the solution to a lot of problems.
Let's give some other people a chance too. Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you. Gentleman right back there.
I have just a question from Switzerland. Reading a lot about the Arab Spring and about your interesting talks. I'm interested about, for instance, details on how the internet has really helped the Arab Spring. I heard, for instance, and that is a question to you in the public, you know much better. I heard that there are even television networks have been created with mobile phones, which helped to connect the people and to create solidarity and directional movements and things like that. And I think that's totally fascinating. I consider the Arab Spring as part of the internet revolution happening now worldwide.
Thank you, thank you. Question was, what can we do to help the continuation, I think you'd want to say, of the Arab Spring? And how does technology relate to that? Obviously, from what we've seen, going back to the very beginnings of that movement, was the brilliant use of technology. And if you go far, far farther back, back to the civil rights movement in the United States, was when people start saying the whole world is watching. And that happened to be very powerful because it was true in a way that it would not have been even a few decades earlier, that things get into a global context in a way they never had before, and that's very explosive. It can't always be controlled or manipulated. It's very much technological, and I think it is becoming a central part of our global civilization. Any other questions? Anything else from our other speakers? Alberto, Susanta? If not, I would like to close it with one thing that I wrote down right at the beginning of somebody's talk and decided to not bring it up until right at the end if there was time, just to kind of come back to some of the concrete machinery that's going on out there in the world in terms of technologies. There was no mention of synthetic genetics, which is essentially the creation of new life forms, microorganisms to be sure. And the first context in which I heard a concrete program being launched was in relation to developing microorganisms that could effectively process what is otherwise waste material from corn crops and so forth in order to effectively make biofuel. So you have, just in that one little packet, you have an entrepreneurial project because it's being launched that way. It's boundary crossing because it breaks rules of what we customarily think of as nature. It has great benefits potentially because it can, a major, fairly inexpensive, which it might well be, form of producing energy would be one of the big transformational developments at the present time. So there you have one technology. It's not a out there in the atmosphere or the ethosphere. It is definitely possible, very definitely possible, and it has implications that go in all directions from the capital world to the kinds of things that Heather was talking about. That's all. I just wanted to get that in there. Anything else? We have just a few minutes if anybody has big questions. If not, I want to thank Susanta and Alberto and Heba and our rapporteur. Would you like to add anything?
No, fine, thank you.
No? Okay, just so nobody is left out. Thank you all very much, and really appreciated your comments. Thank you.